Rosy and Frank's Forest Adventure. Rosy was a young woman with bright, happy eyes. She loved the forest near her house. It was big and full of tall green trees. Rosy had a small white dog named Frank. Frank was a happy dog with a wagging tail. He loved to run, jump, and sniff everything. One cold morning, Rosy got ready for an adventure. She put on her red boots, pink gloves, blue jacket, red bag, and blue hat. "Let's go, Frank," she said. Frank barked, "Woof, woof." He was excited. The forest was quiet and beautiful. The ground was soft with leaves. The air smelled fresh. Birds sang in the trees. Rosy looked at her map. "We will walk to the big oak tree," she said to Frank. "Then we will eat lunch." Frank wagged his tail. He liked adventures. They walked down the path. Rosy saw pretty flowers. "Look, Frank," she said. "Yellow flowers." Frank sniffed the flowers. Then he sneezed. "Achoo!" Rosy laughed. "Bless you, Frank." They kept walking. Suddenly, Frank stopped. His ears went up. He heard something. "What is it, Frank?" Rosy asked. Frank barked. "Woof, woof." He ran to a bush. Rosy followed him. She moved the bush and saw a little rabbit. The rabbit looked scared. "Hello, little rabbit," Rosy said softly. "We won't hurt you." The rabbit hopped away into the forest. "Goodbye, rabbit," Rosy said. "Be safe." Frank barked once. He was happy to see the rabbit. Rosy and Frank walked more. The path was long. They crossed a small stream. The water was cold and clear. Rosy took off her red bag. "It's time to eat," she said. Inside her bag was bread, cheese, and an apple. She also had a bone for Frank. "Here you go, Frank," she said. She gave him the bone. Frank wagged his tail. He chewed the bone happily. Rosy ate her food. She looked at the trees. "This is a good day," she said. Frank barked. "Woof." After lunch, they walked to the big oak tree. The tree was very old and very tall. Rosy touched the tree. "Wow, Frank," she said. "This tree is beautiful." Frank wagged his tail. He liked the tree too. They sat under the tree to rest. The sun was warm. Rosy and Frank felt happy and calm. After resting under the big oak tree, Rosy stood up and stretched. "Come on, Frank," she said. "There's more to see." Frank wagged his tail and jumped up. He was ready to explore. Rosy looked at her map again. "Let's go to the sparkling pond," she said. "It's not far from here." The path to the pond was narrow and covered with tiny rocks. Rosy's red boots crunched as she walked. Frank sniffed the ground, his nose busy finding new smells. As they walked, the trees became taller, and the forest grew quieter. Suddenly, Rosy heard a rustling sound. "Frank, do you hear that?" Rosy whispered. Frank's ears went up. He barked softly, "Woof." Rosy looked around. She saw a small squirrel running up a tree. "Oh, it's just a squirrel," she said with a laugh. Frank wagged his tail and watched the squirrel disappear into the leaves. After a little while, they reached the sparkling pond. The water was very clear, and the sun made it shine like diamonds. "Wow, Frank! Look at the pond," Rosy said. Frank ran to the edge of the water. He sniffed it and then jumped back when his paws got wet. Rosy laughed. "It's just water, silly dog." She sat on a rock near the pond and took off her blue hat. The cool breeze felt nice on her face. She looked at her reflection in the water and saw Frank standing behind her. "Let's play a game, Frank," she said. Rosy picked up a small stick and threw it into the grass. "Go, Frank. Find the stick." Frank ran after the stick. He was very fast. He came back with the stick in his mouth, wagging his tail. "Good boy," Rosy said, petting him. They played the game for a long time. Rosy laughed, and Frank barked happily. After their game, Rosy and Frank started walking again. The forest was getting darker because the sun was lower in the sky. "Frank, we need to go back soon," Rosy said. Frank barked softly. He was a little tired, but still happy. As they walked back, Rosy saw something shiny on the ground. She stopped to pick it up. It was a small silver key. "What is this, Frank?" Rosy asked. Frank sniffed the key. He wagged his tail. "Maybe it opens a treasure box," Rosy said. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. She put the key in her red bag and looked around. "Let's see if we can find what this key opens." Frank barked loudly. He loved adventures. They walked off the path and into a new part of the forest. It was quiet, and the trees were very tall. Rosy saw something in the distance. It looked like a small wooden door in the ground. "Look, Frank," she said, pointing. Frank ran to the door. He barked and scratched at it. Rosy knelt down and pulled out the silver key. "Let's see if this works," she said. She put the key in the lock and turned it. Click! The door opened. Inside was a small box. It was old and covered with dust. Rosy picked it up and opened the lid. "Oh, Frank, look at this," Rosy said. Inside the box were shiny gold coins and a little note. The note said, "To the finder, this treasure is yours. Use it wisely." Rosy smiled. "What a special day, Frank. We found a treasure." Frank barked happily and wagged his tail. Rosy put the box in her red bag. "Let's go home now," she said. As they walked back to the path, the sun set behind the trees. The sky turned pink and orange. Rosy looked at Frank. "Today was the best adventure ever," she said. Frank barked softly, and together they walked home, ready to dream about their next big adventure.